We got a pretty cool guest here. We got Brian Graeb, South Dakota State, and then he's taking on some private waters, and he's going to show us a few things about aging fish.
Yeah, Brian's one of those guys. There's a few guys that when I talk to him, I'm pretty intimidated. Brian's one of those guys. When he starts talking about otoliths and aging fish and the importance of that and private impoundments, and then actually being able to track fish back to where they were born because of the chemical makeup of otoliths, he's an impressive guy to talk with, and I feel quite inferior, but I always look forward to it.
You always look forward to feeling a little bit not as smart as you think you are?
My wife tells me I need to humble myself all the time, and so talking to people that are way smarter than me does that. So,
it does too. We'll learn a ton of stuff. Stay tuned. We're going to learn a ton of stuff about a little bone in a fish's ear, and stay tuned and hang with us. I'm your host, Matt Rayl. I've been working with lakes and ponds for over 20 years, and during that time, I've picked up on a ton of tips and tricks from lake and pond owners all over the country. So if you want to learn how to catch some smiles for your kids and grandkids off your lake, or how to grow some memories off your pond, then come sit with us, Sitting Dockside. Well, welcome back to another Sitting Dockside. I think we pretty excited to bring Brian Graeb. You're brought back for the second time, so you're like the focal celebrity of Sitting Dockside. He also did a talk on, if you have not have heard it, the first Sitting Dockside podcast on habitat. You followed fish for up to 5 years and then added habitat and how they changed. So that's a remarkable talk. And
this is his third appearance, Matt. He came back for the
stand corrected. Yeah,
that's right.
You're the big time. You're gonna be. I'd put you on here as one of the moderators for sure.
It's always fun having Brian on because it reminds me just how uneducated I am. So
we always going to learn. We are always going to learn something. That's for sure.
There's a theoretical world and there's a real world. I'm trying to jump between them, but yeah. Happy to be here. This is a great company, and I learn more from you guys than I do doing my other stuff. So this is powerful. Very much.
Brian, give us, for those people that haven't heard the other podcasts and some amazing stuff about you, give us a brief 3 minutes about yourself and what you've done and before we jump in here.
I'll keep it brief. This is my elevator speech. My passion is later in life transitioning away from academia to the real world. So it's taking science that we've done and I've studied my whole life and translating it to getting stuff done on the ground. It's fun to generate science and create frontiers, but then the real challenge I found, as a second career is now trying to go make this stuff happen for real. And I spent a lot of time in academia, as a professor, tenured. I still keep a foot in there. I teach a couple of fisheries classes at SDSU, continue to have a smaller research program, but I've since spun off and started a fisheries management and consulting company. So Blue Wing Outdoors, we're working primarily from kind of up and down the Great Plains from Southeast Texas to, I was about 90 miles from Canada the other day. So we cover a wide range of area, and it's taking the science that I've accumulated and I've learned from smart people like you all and trying to make things happen, build programs for people and set high bars and try to achieve them. It's just a blast.
Yeah. Well, and then you've forgot the little things, like you've tagged how many yellow perch in the life?
We're up to, I think we just finished this morning. We got some more telemetry tags. We're somewhere north of about close to 70,000 walleye we've tagged in the Missouri River system in South Dakota. And by we, I mean mainly my grad students that are leading that effort. We're going on year 6 of a multi-year study, 3 different grad students, and working with the state. It's a big research funded project, and studying fish dynamics, recruitment, mortality, otoliths, which we're talking about today. We pulled thousands of otoliths out of that system, and mortality. And really a big chunk of that is trying to figure out the role of angling regulations and how they can affect walleye populations. Walleye are bread and butter up here, by far number one sport fish, and generate the lion's share of the economic input for the Dakotas in general.
Right. And then you've also worked with Largemouth and published a few papers too, if I'm going to say so. What, 60? You gave about 60 papers.
I'm very proud to admit that I don't know how many papers I've published so far. I'm getting close to, if I haven't exceeded 60. But yeah, and that mainly represents mentoring graduate students. They're early into my career, I was the first author. Now they're the first author, and I'm just helping them through the process and helping them with the science. And I take that fun spot as the last author position and let them get all the accolades and watch them succeed. But yeah, we're 60 plus or minus a couple, and yeah.
Which says a lot for yourself, getting young people involved in everything else. But
yeah, I think that's one of the most. That's getting young people involved is extremely important. I told Matt earlier, we just hired a guy that actually did his internship in South Dakota. I can't remember who he told me he worked for exactly, but did an internship up there last year. So, and the fact that you're talking about meshing academia with the real world is, man, it's near and dear to what we try to do, because sometimes we find a lack between the two. So it's pretty awesome.
I would say that there's very few people in the academia world that work with private waters or small impoundments or even reservoirs anymore, and they're just going away. And so it's really refreshing to have some good brain power into how we can improve our processes.
I had to leave academia to stay in this world. I keep a toe in there, but academia is shifting hard, and this applied research and not even small waters, just fisheries management, angling, sport fish is becoming a kind of a dying breed out there. So it's a fun place to be.
When you said shifting, what did you mean by that? So
academic programs for a long time, they were kind of built in the 50s, 60s, 70s on sport fish restoration dollars when that came into be. We had this era up through the 80s, early 90s of, all the state land grants were getting lots of funding, doing lots of seminal fisheries management research. And the focus was applied because that's where the money was coming from. And that went on for quite a while, but then programs started to change. South Dakota State, where I still am, we're in the process kind of shifting that direction and shifting away from management towards more basic science, ecology, things like that. And it's not good or bad. It reflects the modern day economics of a higher education. It's all about the dollars, and it's not necessarily how many dollars are coming in. It's how much indirect dollars are coming with that, and prestige, right. And not good or bad. It just is.
Right. What'd you say, Troy? What?
I didn't say nothing. I said nothing.
Oh, wait. It's because my eardrum is what we're going to talk about, actually, eardrum. So that was my little segue.
What kind of? So you're like a 90-year-old making jokes now. I mean, what kind of joke was
that? That's called a segue.
Did you hear about? Did y'all hear about the? Did y'all hear about all the birds that died in Kansas on the highway?
No.
There's a bunch of blackbirds, and they called in some. They thought that it was like COVID. And they called in this epidemiologist. He said it wasn't COVID, and they found like paint on the blackbirds, like toenails and beaks and stuff. And they had this ornithological behaviorists come in and start looking to figure out how they died. And they'd been hit by 98% of them had been killed by trucks. and 2% had been killed by cars. And the reason is when blackbirds are in the road eating, they've got one lookout, and they realized that when they would holler that they would all leave, but they knew how to say caw, caw, but they didn't know how to say truck.
That's terrible. It is.
I know. That's why I told you.
I can't get that 30 seconds back. That's for sure.
Total dad joke. I love it. I've heard that one. Classic.
I saw it this morning. I about passed out. So.
Well, anyway, my segue was really perfect there, and then we're going to talk about eardrums of fish, which I didn't 10 or 15 years ago. I didn't even know they had them, and then that not only do they have them, and why we're going to talk about them. Will they, as Brian will say, are worth their weight in gold in what they teach us of with this fish, where it's been, and a lot of cool other stuff. And but go ahead, Brian, and you have done you have taken eardrums out of fish, literally out of thousands of them, right?
Many tens of thousands, yeah. Yep. Yeah, and gold probably doesn't describe it well. This is an otolith. Inner ear bones. There's 3 pairs of them. Humans have little tiny ones. Fish have great big ones. 3 different sets. Different species have different bones that are a little bit bigger, but it's literally a bone in the inner ear of a fish, and they're used for balance, vibration detection, all kinds of stuff. And they're unique because they're just like a tree ring. So, when a tree or a fish is growing fast, those rings, kind of daily rings, are really far apart. And then in the wintertime, when things slow down, the rings are still growing, but they're really tiny. So they start to stack up. So if you see in this picture here, you get this contrast of annuli where you have these opaque bands. In between there, you have more transparent bands, and you have another opaque bands. That represents growing season for the transparent band, and then wintertime for the annuli or the opaque band. So growing season, winter, growing season, winter, throughout the fish's lifetime. And if you understand how that works, then you can start to piece together how old the fish was. So you start when the fish was hatched, count out towards the outer edge, and basically, just like a tree ring, figure out how old the fish is. So just that piece, the fact that they grow proportionally to the otolith grows proportionally to how the fish grows. And we'll talk about later on that as the fish is growing, this bony structure, calcium, it absorbs the chemistry of where the fish is in its environment. So we can take that chemical signature and reconstruct their historic patterns of where they've been, and all the way back to where they respond. Pretty cool stuff. So
that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So just to paraphrase for a lot of guys that aren't be able to see the image, is that when you showed up, it looks like a little tiny fingernail, like a little white fingernail. And then you have an image of a semi-oval piece. And if you didn't really know, it would look almost like a tree. But you cut this eardrum into a thin slice, right? And then put it under a microscope. And then every winter, it basically slows down in its growth, so it creates a ring, and so on and so forth, that you can age these fish. But can you just take an otolith out and age it, or do you have to cut it down to special?
Our general rule is if we pull a lot of otoliths, and from a smaller fish, if we suspect that it's about age 3 and younger, we can look at it whole view, which would just be the whole otolith. And when I say look at it, I mean we're still looking through a dissecting scope with pretty good power and good lighting. But if we think it's 3 and younger, whole view seems to work well. Anything that's suspected to be older than that, we either mount in an epoxy and take thin slices, or with a lot of fish like bass and walleye, we can just take our thumbnail when you get good at it and crack it in half and turn it upside down and look at the plane that you just cracked, and then shine a light in from the side and do the same type of thing. But it's one of those things. It takes a microscope, a good dissecting scope, I should say, some good light sources, and it's very much an art form. there's a lot of science. We'll talk about some of that today on how to get them and everything you can do to make your estimates really good. But at the end of the day, it takes a lot of experience working with somebody who's aged hundreds of otoliths to get this right. And a lot of times when we're doing this for research, we'll have a minimum of 2 separate readers age each otolith independently. In other words, that they don't know what the other person designated as an age. And then we'll go back through, and if there's any discrepancies, sometimes we'll bring a 3rd reader in and look at them, or we bring them all in together and we'll have 3 people look at the same otolith and come to consensus aging. So yeah, there's lots of steps.
Just so everybody knows, this that does involve the death of the fish. So
correct.
So everybody understands that when you're doing this, there's fish mortality involved here. So
right.
You're just not making a lot of
know that.
live fish that can't hear.
Right.
You're not making that.
No, and as we're going to talk about mortality. You're going to lose a lot of fish. And when I work with clients on this, there's initial shock of, yeah, I'm going to harvest and sacrifice a few of your fish for science. But some of the other things we do, we try to keep big enough sample size to make something robust, but not too many fish. And then we also, if we can, we'll do things like we'll look for diseases. We'll pull their diets out at the same time. And then a lot of times we'll, fillet the fish and have a fish fry. So we're not just killing a fish just for the otolith. We'll get a lot of data off that fish if we go to the point of sacrificing him. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and two, I think one of the points is most folks probably aren't harvesting enough fish anyway. So losing a few fish to benefit the overall age of your reservoir is a good thing. So.
Right. So what does all this aging do for us, Brian?
Multitude of things. So just recreating, the first step we do is we create an age frequency distribution. So give me a second. Let me switch here.
What'd you say? Age frequency distribution?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and does that give you the so you can take the ages and measure it with some of the links, right?
Can y'all see that now?
Yep.
So this is the first step we do. We simply take the frequency of ages in each age class. So number of age 1s, age 2s, 3s, 4s on the case. And so here's a couple populations, one from northern latitude, one from southern latitude. And so the very first thing we do is we start looking, do we have a year class every year in the population? In other words, how is recruitment? And if we would expect with good habitat and good conditions that we'd have a bar, we'd have ages for every age that could be possible. So if fish live to be about age 12, we expect to find representatives of all 12 of those year classes present. Now, it's kind of fun. It gets interesting. A lot of populations I work in, we're missing, multiple year classes during this time period. And we have strong year classes, weak year classes. So we might have a whole bunch of age 2s and no fish that are age 3, 4, and 5. Really, really common, particularly up north here. And that'll tell us immediately that we have recruitment variability. We have something that's preventing successful recruitment every year. Usually habitat.
So you have it.
Point us down in the different directions of fisheries management. But yeah.
Right. So you have a year class, let's say, and like on your side here, you have a big bar on year 1, smaller bar on year 2, and so on, down to this little tiny bar on year 12 from a walleye. But you're saying sometimes that 1 through 12 that you just may have just a missing bar altogether, and they just weren't able to reproduce from some big event or issue into which they just didn't have a year class at all. So because in my brain you think bluegill spawn or largemouth spawn or crappies have a spawn, and they would get at least a little bit of young in there. But you can find out what's causing bad recruitment off of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Typically it's really common in fish. There's no age 0s on these bars. We don't even pay attention to age 0s because they're not recruited yet. So unless you have really, really poor spawning habitat, which happens, you oftentimes produce lots of baby fish, larval fish, billions in some cases. And those things flood the system, but they got to survive and not die of starvation or get eaten by other fish and make it to juveniles. When they start to look like the adults, they go into the fall at some size. Then they got to make it all the way through the winter and show up the next spring. And that's typically when we consider them recruited. So what you're talking about, Matt, yeah, it could happen at any point from spawning all the way up till over winter that we lose entire year classes. It's very, very, very common. And as you start missing year classes, you start drilling down, and one of the first things we do is say, well, what spawning habitat are they producing larvae? In some cases, the spawning habitat is so poor we never see the little tiny larvae show up. But for a lot of fish, we see larvae, and then say, okay, are we seeing juveniles? Do juveniles sit around for a while, and then do they disappear? And here's a good example. I had a lake last year, monster year class of smallmouth bass. We had smallmouth bass flooded the system, and they got up to about 2.5 to 3 inches. And then I was thinking, okay, we're setting the stage for strong recruitment. Then I was out there working one day, and the large bass were just going nuts in the shallow water. And I was doing something else. And I finally started paying attention, and I looked, and the adult smallmouth bass had turned cannibal, and they were just mowing down any juvenile that came out. It was the craziest. And then a few weeks later, we started sampling again. We lost most of the juveniles within a 2 to 3 week period. So, it can happen like that with predation. And, that tells me as a manager, the first thing we did is say, okay, we got to get some more food for the smallmouth bass and get them to leave the babies alone. But yeah, it just kind of points out how fickle it is during that first year of life. It's kind of amazing that fish survive anything.
And what also I see here is that, there's a lot of fish that are younger, and as they get older, and I've had customers say, well, I've only seen one fish float, so that means only one fish has died in the whole system, and that's not the case. With your aging, with that otoliths, you're seeing that multiple are dying or being eaten, and are leaving the system in some way, one way or the other, and that's what it's showing here, right? Now,
a great example is that bottom graph. 70% total mortality. Fish live to be about age 5. This would be
bluegill.
Bluegill down south in Texas. This would be very common. So you think about that. You're losing 70% of that year class every single year to predation and starvation, disease, a whole bunch of natural factors.
Oh, wow.
And so, and I tell people all the time about that. And then we also say fish aren't like other mammals, humans and deer and things like that. They live, kind of constant mortality, then they all die at the end. Fish are dying every year. The stair-step pattern, extremely common in fish. That means that you got 70% mortality from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. It's just kind of constant throughout the years. So, when you start dealing with 70% mortality on fish, it tells you a couple things, that things are going to change really rapidly in that lake if you do something. And then the other part of it is, you don't have that much control over mortality.
Well, let me ask you some questions real quick.
The other thing I think it highlights is that the need, like we try to tell our clients, for good reproduction. And good recruitment. You've got to have fish replacing what you're losing every year, or you wind up with a lake that is going to be pretty well out of balance.
Yeah. Yes, you have to have some recruitment to replace the ones.
With 70% mortality, if you miss 1 year class, it can have huge effects on your prey base.
Right.
Good point. Yeah, that's a good point. So how long do bluegill only live 5 years in the south? How long does the bluegill live up in the north? Does it change?
Yeah, 5, 6, maybe 7. And this is it varies. There's a saying in life that kind of holds true in ecology and really holds true in fish, that you grow fast, die young. So a really fast growing bluegill down south may live 4, 5, 6 years. A slow growing bluegill up north, we routinely see them 14, 15 years old. just kind of really slow kind of growth. So live slow, die old, live fast, die young, kind of holds true. So lots of variability.
What would a graph look like for a largemouth bass in the South? If we were looking at a mortality graph like this for largemouth bass, what would it look like?
For a healthy to trophy bass fishery in, say, Oklahoma South and the Southeast, we rarely see many fish over about 9 years old. So kind of, a little bit shorter than the walleye and a little bit older than the bluegill, but somewhat in between. I figured 9-10 years old is, on average, for the population, is about how old the fish will get.
So if we were to show a client a graph like this and they say, all right, well, I'm losing 60% of, I've seen a 60% mortality rate. I've never even seen that. Why are you still telling me to harvest, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds of bass per acre per year? What's the best explanation for them on that?
It's a constant influx into the system. So the way to think about this, and really, if you're to that point, that means you probably have consistent recruitment. That means, you're losing 70% a year, but your reproduction is through the roof. So, your lake can only hold so many fish, and that's got to be spread out across all these year classes. So, you're kind of, for lack of a better word, you're at carrying capacity. So, once that's hit, because you have a constant stream of new fish coming in, even though you're losing, probably for largemouth bass down there, we'll call it 45% mortality rate. So still pretty high. You're losing 40-50% of your fish a year, but you're gaining a whole bunch of fish every year too. So that population as a whole hits a tipping point, and if you don't harvest, you want to bring it back down below there. So it's kind of the opposite. You're fighting that consistent recruitment coming into the population, trying to drive down get it down well down below carrying capacity. So that help make sense. It's kind of a hard. It's backwards because you're losing fish, but you're also gaining a whole bunch of fish every year.
Right. And I think that's why we always see that we have these year classes and we see our fish. We have a few fish that are large, but then we have these large numbers of 10 to 15 inch fish. And I think that drives the point home that we're recruiting all of those smaller fish every year, but we're losing the bigger ones year in, year out. So
perfect segue. So the next thing we do with Otalath, once we figure out recruitment and mortality, is we look at growth rates. So very, very common that those 10 to 15-year-old fish are all age 4 through 10, 11, if you're down south. So all those year classes coming in are all capping out about the same size. So they'll grow up to that size and stay there. So that's why I say when you pull a 12, 13-inch bass out of a kind of a heavy stunted population, that fish might be 3 years old, that fish might be 10 years old. And the only way to decipher that is with Otalath. So we use Otalath then with the size of the fish to estimate growth rates then.
So not only are you seeing how long they're living, some recruitment, now you're actually correlating year classes with length.
Yep.
And so now you're going to be able to see, and that is the one big thing that the people I help manage and consult with, that's really the driver for us. Is a lot of times they'll see these, all these fish that are the same size, and then we, pull some aging out of them, and then they're all, this fish is so little, you think you just kiss it and throw it back in and it's going to grow up and get big. And it's not the case when they're seeing 6-year-old fish, that are 12 inches. It's just, no matter if you just hand fed it the rest of its life, it's really never going to be a superior fish.
Right.
Can't reach its potential.
Right. I think that's pretty wonderful. A few other questions about length of mortality of fish. A yellow perch, how long does it live?
We've aged them out of Lake Michigan up to 14, 15 years old.
Really? I thought they would be younger.
Well, it's a big, deep, cold lake. In South Dakota up here, even in cold water, we have great perch fisheries, and it's pretty rare to get a perch beyond about age 6 up here.
Okay.
Wow.
So pretty variable. All these fish, you'll see the pattern is deeper, colder, slower growing fish in those populations live older, and then
so the same way with largemouth bass in the north, even though it's a northern strain.
We routinely see bass 15, 16, common, and then you get a rare individual that's 18, 19, 20, 22 years old. It's not unheard of.
I've never seen a bass drinking a beer.
That's good.
Come north, and a lot of those you go to Canada, and it gets more and more extreme. So yeah, it's latitudinal variation for sure.
I'll be. Yeah. All right. What else you got for us, Brian? This is good.
So this is this is why it's worth it. And so you start here. We've got mortality. We've got recruitment, just from one little graph. Mm-hmm. Now we take that and we say, okay, we have age 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We figure out the mean length of fish at those different ages. So say we have 14 individuals at age 5. We take the mean length of those 14 individuals and say, okay, for largemouth bass at age 5, maybe the mean length is 19.7 inches. That's growth rate, right? And we do that for every length group. The cool part about we've started to amass in the era of big data, we've got some pretty big standardized data sets that we can start to ask the question like, okay, we have, say our mean length at age 5 is 19 inches. What should we expect of largemouth bass or bluegill or walleye, crappie, whatever, for that region of the country? And this is broken down by ecoregion. So a very, very helpful tool. We can fit growth curves to these data and then compare it to standardized ecosystem specific standards. So it could be that we have the average size of a bass in that ecoregion is only 17 inches and we're 2 inches bigger than that. So we might be up in the 80th, 90th, 95th percentile of growth in those ages. And so that becomes super useful. And it's very common to see, either the young fish are growing really fast and in the upper percentiles, and then the old fish get slow way down, or sometimes it's vice versa. We might have young fish kind of hanging in there, then they break through a bottleneck, and all of a sudden they jump up to the 75th, 80th percentile for those older ages. And we can break that down by length group, by age, by big fish, small fish, by ecoregion, all with this little Otalath. That's what I'm saying. You pull this thing out, you get the ages, you start playing with all the data you get from that thing, and it's amazing.
So you can actually take it and see even compare the growth on the same fish in certain areas and see when they're doing better, when they're smaller or bigger, or overall. Is that what you mean?
Very common to see those, and hopefully you see that you're in the high percentiles across the board, but that doesn't always happen. So, for example, some of our Texas lakes, we have, when we started out, we had really good growth of young fish, up to about age 4 or 5, they were in the 80th, 90th percentile, and we had lots of smaller prey in there. Then when they got 6, 7, all the way out through 9 and 10, they just tanked. So that tells us there's some important transition in there, some prey type, it was habitat for us in the main part, but it tells us that there's something going on later in life that we need to hone our management in on and try to plug that hole and get them growing fast throughout their whole life. Because as Troy mentioned, you miss a little bit of potential and you never get that back. So our goal is to have fish, I always tell people, 75th percentile and higher across every age of their lifespan, so that you have the potential, to reach their full potential at that 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, however long they're going to live.
So you can pull some otoliths. Let's say you went to a new lake and you looked at a few otoliths. You were able to see that certain transition in this fish's life, they do well, and certain times they do not. And so that's when you sharpen your pencil or you put your thinking cap on of why that fish at that age, at that length, is not hitting its potential. And that's where we need to focus on. Not just by looking at the surface water and say, hey, maybe it's spawning habitat, maybe it's this, and throwing a bunch of darts out here. You really are homing into all done from an eardrum. A little
and you may have fish that look really, really good. I mean, you may have what you would consider to be, a healthy 19-inch fish, and you're like, it's doing its deal, but then you pull the otolith and age it, and it should be, 2 pounds and 6 inches longer than that. I mean, I think and then you can start zeroing in where that's where that crucial time frame was in the life of that fish, where it was lacking or where it failed. Was that during a management time that you were trying to recoup that fish? Or recoup that size. It's hard to say, but I think I'm getting what Brian's saying. It lets you zero in on that aspect of that fish's life and that time frame. It's pretty amazing.
Yes.
We'll circle back to that's another thing. I've just started culling fish a little bit differently based on what we're finding with this. But here's a great story, and Matt, you and I have talked about it a lot. Troy, I'm sure you've heard it. I spent the better part of the last 2.5 days tracking down 3 to 5 inch bluegill. There's a drought on them right now from anywhere I can find. I finally found a couple sources today because I have a lot of populations where growth of younger fish is starting to slow down just a little. It's not slow, but it's too slow for me. And I look at the bluegill, and most of my bluegill are 5, 6, 7 inches and bigger. So, I know from Otalath how old those fish are. I know from standardized data how big they should be, the bass. And I know that to plug that hole, I need to plug that prey supply. So I'm stocking 3 to 5 inch bluegill in spring, early summer to try to get those small, medium-sized fish to catch up. The big fish are growing fine, but those small fish, I know from all this data, are starting to slow down. So I'm trying to plug that hole. So it's really zeroing in on just a specific part of the population and then getting fine-tuning management.
Yeah, I've had this conversation multiple times this year. It's been pretty interesting this season on finding,
Crazy,
I guess, what you would consider medium, large, and jumbo size bluegill, anywhere from that 3 to say 6 inch size range, depending on the fishery you're working on. But
yep, man,
hatcheries have just been decimated, and I think whole other conversation. But folks are at home. Some of them have disposable money, and they want to make their houses look good with plants, and they want to make their ponds look good with big fat fish. So they're feeding them a lot right now.
Yeah,
which is great, unless you're looking for bluegill.
Yeah, that's right.
Troy, here's a good conversation. I was in a lake in Kansas a couple weeks ago, and this 19-inch fish you're talking about, we had slugs of fish from 18 to 20 inches, and they were all pretty good. And relative weight was fairly good for post spawn, just average to a slightly above average fish. And we started looking at things, and we pulled the otoliths out of them, and then those fish were 8, 9, 10 years old. So we started culling those fish. It was a hard thing for the landowner to swallow at first until we explained that this 19-inch fish is taking up space. We're going to start to stock bluegill and bring in new genetics, new fish. We need to make room for these fish. We started culling from the top down.
That's
uncommon, but you probably see that a lot. Yeah,
uncommon, and it's hard to explain that. We run into that in some different management scenarios, particularly female bass. But you've got to make room for smaller fish to have the ability to grow. You've got to open up that slot where they can move into it, and you've got to provide them with the exact forage they need to move into it. And explaining that somebody may have to remove a 3.5, 4, 5, 6 pound bass.
Yep,
they do, and in their mind, in the Southeast, we think about it this way too. In a lot of really good scenarios, you would think that 6 pound bass may only be 3 years old.
Right.
And that could be the case. But you're talking about fish that are at the end of their lifespan and they never reach their full potential, and they're going to die anyway. So remove them and open up that space.
Yep.
It's hard to do.
It's pretty cool, man. I love it.
Yeah.
But again, we do that because we age the fish. We know where they're at. So that makes
that's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But otoliths give us a little more information too, don't they?
A lot more. This is I'll shift gears here.
While we're doing that, you can tell that we're pretty far away from each other because Troy is in Florida, and it's dark at night behind you. And then if you look at Brian Graeb, it's still daylight there.
The fact that you mentioned that, I literally just looked at his window behind him, and I was like, man, it's still daylight there. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Pretty far north latitude too. That makes a pretty big difference.
It does.
Now, when we have the same video conference in early January, it'll be dark here at 4:30, and you guys will be basking in it.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
Okay, Otalath. This is fun. This is wild stuff. So, we talked about otoliths grow proportional to the way the fish grow. So, during we can do things. I'll just start at a larval fish. A fish hatches, and within about 3 or 4 days, they form an otolith in their head. And from the moment they form that otolith, they just keep adding layers to the outside of that otolith. And when the fish is young, during the daytime when they're active and feeding, they're growing fast. And at nighttime, they slow down. So you get that day-night, fast-slow. We can actually, up to about 70 to 90 days, we can pull an otolith out of a young fish and trace how old they are in days based on it. So you take that principle and you just think about microscopic layers of bone being put on that fish every day. And as that bone is being put on, it absorbs the chemistry of the water around it. Fish, they absorb the chemistry they're in. So some really smart people a lot of years ago said, well, I wonder if that chemistry of that bone reflects the chemistry of the water, and can we start to track where fish are based on what happens? And it actually, a lot of this work was started out in the marine world, where you have fish that are going from the ocean to freshwater and back out again. Wild chemistry changes. So we use strontium and barium are the two of the elements we're looking at. And in marine systems, those are radically different. So we could trace the otolith, and they said, okay, it's in freshwater, it's in saltwater, freshwater, salt, back and forth. And since that time, the freshwater guys picked it up, and we've been doing this now for 6-7 years on a Missouri River system. So most of North Dakota and all of South Dakota, where the Missouri River bisects both those states, we've been trying this approach in there. And I have some example data from one of my grad students that did this on. This is just one of the reservoirs, Lake Oahe, a couple hundred river miles. I think it's the 3rd or 4th biggest reservoir in the country. And so the idea is that, we're different parts of the reservoir, depending on how close they are to tributary streams, have different chemistry. So the stable chemistry of the water is reflective of the underlying geology. So a stream coming off of western South Dakota running through the Badlands or different geologic formation is going to have radically different chemistry from an eastern South Dakota stream coming off completely different geology. So all these different geologies are coming into the lake, and so that chemical footprint of the lake varies up and down depending on where you're at, and it's fairly distinct with modern equipment. So we sent this grad students spent a good year and a half running all up and down the river, pulling multiple water samples just to look at the chemical signature of water during low flow, high flow, kind of getting ranges to figure out what the chemistry of that water should be. And once we had that, then we went out and we got several hundred, if not a few thousand otoliths from all up and down the Missouri River. And we took each one of these otoliths, and then you got to use really fine, we couldn't handle it with our fingers, it's got to be really clean. Pulled them out, put them away, and we took them to a lab in California, and we just rented the lab out for about 2 to 3 weeks a year and sat down with the laser ablation machine. So literally we shot lasers through this otolith from the outside to the core on a couple different spots, and then the gas that burned off of that laser ablation got sucked into a mass spec machine, and we got the chemical signature of this otolith all along its axis. So we could look at different annuli, and sometimes we do a long streak, sometimes we just punch out the annuli, annuli growing season back and forth. But anyhow, we used all that equipment to get the chemical signature of the fish as it grew. And then once we compared that back to the footprint of the water, we get things that look like this weird graph here. So this is pretty cool. So all these fish were collected in 2013. That's the year we collected them. So we're looking backwards with this analysis. So in this case, almost to 2014, we can go back almost to 2009 with some of these older fish. So pretty big span of time in here. And there was the genesis of this project was 2011 was a massive record flood year for us. So the Missouri River system flooded, and one of our big questions was, did walleye get flushed out of these lakes? Did they move downstream? And pretty cool stuff. So you can see fish kind of hanging out up here. A lot of these are up in North Dakota. 2011, the flood hit. A lot of these fish ended up a couple years later, moved all the way downstream. They ended up by Oahe Dam. So a few hundred river miles downstream and ended up at the dam. Then we repeated this study on the next lake downstream. And we found for Lake Sharp, which is right below Lake Oahe, like it was like 20-some% of all of the walleye in that lake chemically came from Lake Oahe, and most of them came during that flood year. Then we went down, we had 2 more reservoirs below that. By the time we got to the lowest reservoir, we estimated something like 33, 34, 35% of all the walleyes in Lewis and Clark Lake came from one of the reservoirs upstream. We had fish from Lake Oahe, and it got clear down there. So really a cool tool that answered, it really reshaped how they thought about walleye management. You can't manage just for a reservoir if all your fish are, you got fish coming in, you got fish going out, kind of throws a big wrench into everything. So from a management perspective, it had made decisions on stocking, on how things are being managed. But from a pure science perspective, holy moly, to be able to say that this fish hatched in the Cannonball or Knife River, hung out in North Dakota, then when the flood came, it ran clear downstream and really put together some unique movement patterns for the whole system. So really fun project. And then we followed it up a couple years later with another student that built on this data set. And we went back, we were trying to identify a really important spawning habitat in Lake Sharp, which is one below this. And it found out that, there's these small backwater habitats that make up less than 1% of the whole surface acre. The whole lake is a really small percentage of these things, but something like over 50 to 60% of all the walleyes produced in the lake come from a couple of these little tiny habitats. So we started to answer questions like how important are these little side channel backwater habitats, and they're radically important. And we were able to answer that using tools, all coming back to this little otolith and the chemistry of it. So powerful stuff. And since then, there's been a slew of studies following up on it. It's a hard thing to do. It takes a lot of work and a lot of money to, shoot otoliths with lasers. But the results are fascinating. And if you have the right questions, like we did on this big of a scale, it works really well. Now, if you're in a small pond and you want to say, did my fish swim from here to here? Most of the chemistry in a smaller pond isn't going to be that different. So you couldn't use this technique. But as the system gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can do stuff.
I guess on large scale reservoirs too, and on chains of reservoirs. I guess if you started seeing mortality in a certain, year class of fish, you could start wondering and I guess hypothesizing that maybe there was a contaminant that is causing that. If it's a younger death rate possibly than what it should be, and you could trace that possible contaminant back to where it happened possibly. Would it lay down that type of stuff in the otolith, or is that kind of far-fetched?
It probably would. I'm not sure that it'd have to be a really stable chemical compound. It might, but I think it'd be hard to pick up because the fish that got zapped by it, you couldn't get them. But I'm sure there's some absorption. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, but that'd be a cool thing to look at. There's on really, really old otoliths, there's probably not too many fish alive, but nuclear testing done in the 40s or 50s, there was some big nuclear event that blasted out a big radiocarbon signature, and old fish, probably to this day, if there's a fish old enough, you can go back far enough and pick up that signature from that nuclear test that was done. And a lot of crazy, the stuff that fish absorb. For a lot of years, when this first started, that was how they ground truth, like sturgeon and really old lived fish, as well as, trying to count 60, 70 rings. But if they found that one year with the nuclear event, they could ground truth and say that was 19, whatever it was, and then go forward from there. So,
Amazing.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So also I've heard that they could medicate, and it creates a yellow line on their, like if you medicate the fish. You can. What is that? Tell me more about that.
So this is a really common thing that we stock fish like crazy. I'm just as guilty as everybody else, and you got to understand the reality of what's actually surviving. But one of the big questions that comes up for state agencies is they're stocking all these walleyes, and you measure success or perch or bluegill bass, whatever it is. Most agencies say, we stocked, I think South Dakota was something like 48 million walleye last year. Well, that's great. How many of those fish actually ended up in the population? So it's a question that folks have been tackling for several years. And so one of the ways to answer that is you say, okay, let's come back in the fall, catch juvenile walleyes or perch or bluegill bass, whatever it is, and try to figure out which ones are stocked versus which ones are produced naturally, right? So it's been going on for quite a while. So OTC, oxytetracycline, is probably the most common. It is a medication used in hatchery, but it also, when you take a vat of small fish and you dunk them in a tank of OTC for 4, 6, 7 hours, something like that. And like I was telling, the bone will absorb that OTC, and then it'll keep growing. And then in the fall, you come back and you pull the otolith out, you take a thin slice of it, and you use different light filters on a microscope, and you get the filter right, and all of a sudden that one ring of OTC will just glow bright green. It's pretty crazy. And then so it's a way to mark fish. So you can have marked fish, which came from a hatchery, versus unmarked, which were naturally produced, and then you evaluate the true success of your stocking program. But yeah, OTC is really common. We've done a little bit with calcine. It kind of works the same, but OTC, Minnesota, the Dakotas, a lot of perch and walleye that get stocked are marked with that, so they can figure out what was wild and what was hatchery raised.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. Would stock all these. A lot of times, like you were saying, the intermediate bluegill gets depleted because that's just where they're not producing enough, and the largemouth bass start to stunt. But it'd be really interesting to see success rate years down the road from how many fish we stock and to how many get to that sexually mature age to reproduce. We know some are because we see success, but how many and why? That would be really cool to.
Well, we stumbled on this. Is a hard thing to tell a client, but we did this kind of by accident as part of one of the research projects. But we had a massive stocking of a couple of them of advanced size, probably 3/4 pound up to 5 or 6 pound bass into an existing fishery. And those fish didn't have OTC, but we put pit tags in every single bass that was stocked that year. And then we tracked the survival rate through the years, and survival rate at year 1 was 50%, year 2 was 50, year 3. So we lost half of those fish every single year after they were stocked, and natural mortality in that system was quite a bit lower. So the stock fish had higher mortality than the natural fish. We figured that out with the science, but now I feel compelled to tell people that, yeah, I'll go get these fish, we'll stock them as part of our program, but you realize half of your investment's going to die if you're lucky during this first year. And that's for advanced size fish. Once you start stocking fingerlings, mortality goes way, way, way up. So it's one of those things, like we talked about, mortality is just present in the fish world. It's a fact of life we deal with, and it's usually offset by recruitment, but we account for it and adjust stocking and think about things differently once we know about it.
And adjust stocking, as more we learn, the more precise we can get to the right amount of stocking and the most value to get to the success of what we're trying to do. That being said, you say fish die, and the fish are dying all the time in our lake. Why are they? This is a very simple question, but it's asked a lot. Why are they not floating?
So by and large, most fish when they first die sink. They sink down to the bottom, and it's not until bacteria within the stomach cavity start going to town and produce gas that their cavity fills up, then they float to the top. A lot of times, fish don't make it to the top because turtles are getting them. They get a slash in them. Their stomach. What am I trying to think of? Gas bladder doesn't hold the air in. So there's lots of things that prevent a fish from filling up with gas and going to the surface. So having worked with bazillions of fish kills, it's not very common for fish to come up all at once. So a couple things. It doesn't happen just one day overnight. Being in some of the lakes, and you guys have probably seen this, if you're in a lake enough, you see an occasional floating fish, 1 or 2 a month. So you do see some of it, but most of them just never make it up there. Turtles, one bite from a turtle that gets through that gaseous layer and the fish stays sunk. Crayfish, all kinds of stuff chew on bass and fish in general.
Yeah. My point of view on this is this is conjecture or anecdotal evidence, is that if this stress event is slow and the fish purge and have empty guts, the fish won't float.
Yeah.
Like winter times, or low DO for a long period of time and they're not feeding. But and vice versa, if you have a big stress event very rapidly when they're full of guts, their guts are full because they fed the night before, which I've heard that several times, and they're dead the next morning. And then they float like crazy. That's my 2 cents.
Makes a lot of sense. If there's no food for bacteria to eat in the stomach, then they can't inflate that cavity. Yeah,
exactly. That's pretty cool. And be honest with you, even I don't look at mortality as a product of how I manage, and I probably need to do that more, and knowing that fish are going to, and just clock out, and it's really hard to catch that 1.5 pound bluegill and harvest it because they think if they put it back, it's going to get to 2 pounds, and that's not always the case, is what you're saying,
Well, 2 things here. I am confident if you pulled my Otalath, although my birth certificate says I'm 43, I'm actually like 16. And if you ever find me dead and floating, I can assure you my belly's probably filled from the night before. It's going to be true.
But can we recreate your life history based on the chemical signature of that Otalath?
Oh, most definitely. I think so.
Yeah, you probably don't want to. We don't need
to publicize it or anything, but yeah, you probably can.
That's right. Well, you got any? This is your last slide, right, Brian?
I don't know. Should have checked.
What do you think? You going to start pulling Otalaths, Troy?
Yeah, I think I have to some.
I do too.
Do what?
I said on the female largemouth, you think it would be interesting to know how young or old those fish are when you have to harvest, though, wouldn't it?
The problem with harvesting female bass is that a lot of money was expended on that one female bass a lot of times, unless if you're stocking advanced size fish. So when you say, hey, you know what, we're going to shock today and I'm going to kill 5 fish that are, that we stocked that were 7 pounds or something. I mean, there's a pretty big monetary loss there that's hard to overcome. There are some scenarios that I can think of off the top of my head, but I've talked about this in the past too. There are some scenarios where I know that it was a solid stocking of just F1 fish. I don't know what it's going to benefit. But I think I would be better off to start fresh and then start aging after 2 or 3 years, because if I'm 12 or 14 years into an F1 fishery, I mean, I guess I could always stock new F1 genetics, but it would be cool to know how old the fish actually are. But that fishery is probably not going to ever overcome the fact that there's so many back crosses now that you just have a poor genetic deal going on there. So there's probably some other opinions on that. Now, obviously, there are scenarios with mixed strain stockings with Floridas, F1s, and Northerns, or straight Floridas and straight Northerns that, yeah, I mean, I've got to start doing it in some scenarios, and I probably will, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a good piece of the puzzle. That's for sure. But
if you have, are we going to keep going?
yeah, let's see this last slide here, and then.
Well, forget about the slide for a minute. I think I've been successful talking clients into letting me harvest fish for odorless. One fish in my whole career that the guy made me release. It was about a 9-pound female. Ugly as sin, but old as heck. I really wanted that odorless, but we let her go. And I killed a couple 6-7 pounders. But the way I do it, and we can talk about methods, you can get into a lot of trouble if you do it wrong, because there's so much bias built into how you pull fish out and what you're looking at. And you're going to make some pretty heavy decisions based on your findings. So a lot of times I'll come in on the front end of a program and we'll do a big age structures analysis. So, I'll try to get, 40, 50, 60, if I can get them, fish of all sizes. And within that, I'll make sure that I take almost every single one of those fish. So you're getting a fairly random sample. If I got lots and lots and lots of small fish, I might back off on those, but I make sure I get from, age 2, what I think are age 2 all the way up. I'll take every single one of those fish. Because the way you collect the data and you start analyzing, you can do a whole bunch of powerful stuff with odorless, but if you don't get it right from the start, you send yourself down rabbit holes that you don't want to go down. So, for example, if you don't, those old fish, they're worth their weight in platinum, because then you go way far back and you can see historic growth patterns versus current growth patterns and all kinds of neat stuff. But the small fish are important too. You got to see what they're doing. But so anyhow, I'll come in on the front end of a program, do a big age structured analysis. That's odorless and growth and mortality. And then we start to implement all the management strategies. And then I'll probably wait 2 full growing seasons, come in and pull out another round of odorless. And you're doing it in the spring typically to get the best range of sizes. And it's just that one-time sample, and we'll do another, 30, 40, 50 fish if we can get them, and just do it again. And then it might be a couple more years down the road. So it's not usually something I'm doing every year, and it's not every lake I'm doing it in. It's the really actively managed lakes that we're doing it, but it's a great way to track the progress towards your objectives and
Well, and I think too, on top of that, I think if it's a brand new lake that they don't know the stocking history, you don't know the stocking history. I don't think not only checking odorless, but also trying to check, as easy as it is now, track that genetic, that genetic compilation in the lake and see what genetic fish you actually have. I mean, is it all Florida? I mean, in Indiana, obviously you shouldn't have any Floridas, anything with Florida strains in it. So you're dealing with pretty well northern bass. But in the Southeast, I mean, you could have such a mixed basket of fish. I think you've got to start looking at both of those things, genetics and ages. So,
yeah,
great point. I should have been more specific. We calculate growth rates by sex, so males, females, and then if we're down south and we're doing it, we'll do it by sex and by genetics. So Florida, gotcha. Northern, and somewhere in between. So yeah, male and female differences are huge, and you got to separate those out to get better estimates of either one of them. And then if we can, you're exactly right, we do it by genetics too. We learned that if you don't have enough prey, that the northern bass can grow just as fast or just as slow as a Florida bass. It don't matter.
Really?
Yeah. And this is one of the things, if you don't have enough prey. Yeah. So say that again.
That was kind of a joke. Florida bass growth sucks when they don't have food, and their northern bass grow just as fast as they do under those circumstances. Both really slow.
Oh, I guess.
Odorless humor.
Yeah. I guess I didn't hear that. I didn't hear the but boom. Yeah.
Hey, so we've got odorless humor and blackbird humor in this segment. Yep. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Ka. Odorless.
Yeah.
Look, it really is. I mean, after our last conversation when we had everybody together, I started thinking about it more heavily. But I mean, it's really weighing on me now. There are some reservoirs, there's some private impoundments that I need to do this on, and I'm just I haven't started it yet, so I'm going to.
Well, where an expert is that would help you out.
I'm just going to cut them off behind the ears, and I'm going to send them to Brian and let him enjoy
Give me the head. I'll get them done for you. Yep.
That's great.
That's right. So, hey, Any closings for you, Brian?
Nope. I think we covered it. I'm kind of an otolith geek. I have to admit it. These things are pretty awesome.
I like people that are geeks in a special little realm. That's awesome stuff, buddy.
Yep. Yeah, we do otoliths, but we don't do enough. And we definitely don't get it into the detail that you're going to, Brian, and that's pretty cool to kind of explore those methods. And it is something that we probably need to look at doing in certain scenarios too. I mean, it tells a lot of pieces of the puzzle, especially on new lakes and that sort of thing. So, but it was pretty awesome for you to come here, hang out with us, and teach us a few things and teach listeners a few things too. Appreciate it.
Always fun to be here.
Yeah, it's always great talking with you, Brian. I appreciate it tremendously. It's great.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
And I feel stupid. So.
Well, we're pretty lucky in the lake world. Bluegill, bass, perch, walleye, they have gigantic otoliths that are easy to age. We've done stuff on common carp. They have tiny fragile otoliths. Gizzard shad, oh my goodness. You look at a gizzard shad otolith cross-eyed and they turn to dust. All this high print is, it's a mess. But we're in bass, bluegill, we're lucky to be most of my work. So I've aged a lot of different species, and I'm very comfortable not going back to most of those species.
Listen, if you get a shipment from me and it's a bunch of dead fish, don't think it's like this thing from The Godfather where I'm sending you something and you're supposed to sleep with the fishes. I just need an otolith thread, please.
Real. Yep.
All right, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matt.
Good talking with y'all. See you, Brian.
Yep. See you guys.
This podcast, Sitting in Dockside, is brought to you by Private Water Natural Resource Association, a nonprofit built just to educate private pond and lake owners on water quality and fisheries and all of that good stuff. There's videos, there's places to read, and there's a community built right into that website. So if you want to learn more, jump to pwnra.org and click. And by all means, make sure that this continues in the future. Podcast, education, video, become a member. If nothing else, there's tons of platforms. YouTube, Facebook. Just hit like, send a comment. We appreciate everything you can do here at PWNRA.